Okay, there we go. Hello, hello, and welcome to my stream. We're doing a bit of a different stream day today because it's Memorial Day, so I got to have the day off, which was nice, which also means that I get to do a bit of a different stream and a different type of stream today. So on Friday, which was May 22nd, it was actually like World Goth Day, which is pretty funny to me as a concept that there is a World Goth Day, but also kind of cool. And of course, everyone has been kind of marking the occasion. I actually attended a festival that my partner is playing at for World Goth Day that had all of these amazing bands performing and also had a bunch of amazing vendors and even a whip cracking tutorial. Like, that was really cool. But yeah, it was this really amazing kind of community event that had a lot of fashion, and that was happening all over. And I, one, realized that on YouTube at least, I know I've done streams, I guess more in this style on TikTok before, but I haven't done this yet on YouTube, and I forget. Thank you so much, Aqua. Thank you, thank you. Hi. I forget that it's not the first thing people know about me because my general aesthetic on the day-to-day is obviously very different. So, Aqua, you know what's funny? You remember how a year ago practically Kenzie was like, hey, could you do a purple makeup look? And I was like, I will try. I don't have anything purple. And I couldn't track down a good, like a purple that would actually show up well. Finally. Finally. I mean, it's only been forever. It probably wasn't a full year, but still, it was way too long. But here I am. I finally made a purple makeup look, and yes. I don't know why purple as a color is so much harder for me to work with than um, like a deep blue or deep green, which is what I normally go towards when I'm doing like darker makeup styles, but here we are. But yeah, I hope you're doing well, by the way. Hello. Hello, hello. Today we're going to be talking about seminal goth films. And this took me down a bit of a rabbit hole because there were some films on here that I haven't seen since I was very small. And you get so used to certain things being just part of the repertoire that it can be quite easy to forget that they are not for a lot of people. So that is kind of one thing we're going to be talking about today is some of the films that led to what we understand as, like, I guess, part of the goth canon or culturally goth canon of films, and also some of the distinctions between like goth horror and gothic horror, because there are a lot of interchangeable components, but they're technically three different styles of filmmaking and genres. So I think that's really interesting to explore. And Aqua, thank you so much. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. It's I found this one that's like color changing. I actually have it here. Can you see this? Like, it changes color. It's cool, but it also does not. It was a process to figure out how to get this to work. But I'm glad. I'm so glad. Um, it was. Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that too, because I know today is a day that a lot of people were able to have off from work, so it gave a bit of a long weekend if you weren't working over the weekend, or at least it hopefully gave you a day of rest. And if that is the case, fantastic. I know not everybody. I was expecting that I was going to be working today, so I was pretty surprised because it is normally a pretty big, um, like, people are shopping at home and sales day. So if you do what I do for work, then that is definitely a day you're working. But I was pretty surprised and kind of happy to not be today, so that was cool. Um, Hi, Brand. Hello, hello. Happy Memorial Day to you as well. Hello. Today we're doing it's Return of the Goth EC. So it's going to be we're talking about goth movies and some of the very first what's often credited as some of the first kind of Gothic style films, and they're actually a lot earlier in the filmmaking history than you might think. Because some of them came out like when films first started, silent films. Some of the very first films ever made were actually very much kind of Gothic horror, Gothic films. And I think that's absolutely amazing. But yeah, I'm actually going to have a list of all the films that I talk about today, because I actually have this really long list, and I realized it's like, wait, but there's more, but there's more. I have this really long list, and it's definitely uh, whew, nowhere close to exhaustive, but I will be posting that in the description after the live is done. So if you're curious about any of these films, I highly, highly recommend to watch them. Some of them I think are really obvious, at least on a personal level, and how they may have influenced me. Some of them are probably pretty obvious if you have ever come across or seen like even goth aesthetics in the world, or yourself have been part of the community, then I imagine you have definitely heard of these films, or at the very least seen something about them, because even though they had such a big effect on a very specific, I guess you could say, subculture and community, there was a larger effect, I think, overall as well. And Brant, was it more than vampire movies? Yes, so much more. So much more. Although vampire movies are absolutely a cornerstone when it comes to a lot of the themes that are explored in goth films and gothic horror films. And I did kind of want to explore a little bit of the distinction between those three things, because there's definitely the assumption of what it is to be interested in the, I guess, could you call it the aesthetics? The aesthetics that are going to show up the most often in certain types of filmmaking and certain types of creation that others would attribute to being part of like a goth look or a goth style. But vampire movies are definitely a big part. Actually, that brings me to my first two that I have as recommendations, but also as just kind of things I noticed are seminal, and they are some of the earliest movies made. The first one is Nosferatu from 1922. 1922. That is one of the very first films ever made. That's wild. It's not the first, but it is one of the first ones. I actually am going to bring up really quick just to compare when the very first film ever made was, and we will explore this, we will see. Because it's kind of wild to me how quickly, when it came to making films, the first things that filmmakers wanted to explore was the experience of fear and capturing that sense. Oh my god, Twilight. Oof. Twilight is, what do we call Twilight? What is Twilight? Twilight is funny. Twilight is funny. I will put it in the funny category. Now, I will say, I was definitely when I was like in elementary school, I came across Twilight. It was a influential thing for me. But I will also say Twilight and Harry Potter were both like book series that actually had a lot to do with deprogramming me from a very intense kind of indoctrinated religious environment I had gotten myself wrapped into. So it was because they were very helpful for me in that way, and especially as like a child, they were very effective. Hi, Zongton. Hello, hello. And I actually, yeah, you know what's interesting though? I feel like fear is a really important emotion to explore on a thematic level in films. But, one second, let me remember to look up the first movies ever made first. Wait, sorry for the click clacking. But I also feel like, oh wow. Okay, so the very first film ever technically made was like a short scene in 1888 that was like 2 seconds. Um, but the first actual movie ever made was, let's see, 1878. Yeah, okay. Whoa. It was a man riding a horse, but in terms of, I guess, narrative movies, you would probably have, what was it, that French film of the guy that goes to the moon? Oh, the first motion picture. So that's interesting. Okay, so there's kind of differences. And it was, whoa. That's so cool. Okay, so early 1900s, but I guess, okay, so either way, some of the very first movies that were made that had, what do you call it? That were, I guess, available on the wider, like, largest level were made in, I think, the early 1900s to 1910. So by 1922, that is still exceptionally early. It's before you could record sound in the way, obviously, that you can now, but it was definitely before you could record talking films. So you had an orchestra that was sitting in the front of the film, which is why, of the movie theaters, which is why there's those big areas in the front of movie theaters. That used to be where the orchestra would play for the, like, the films, because they didn't show them as consistently. But and then Brant was asking if was super into Twilight. Kind of, in a way, yes, I guess. I was definitely very into the first two books, and then I got really annoyed at Bella. I got really annoyed at Bella, and I fell off really fast. And I think the thing too is that a lot of the books were like, they were, I think I missed some of the train that was the original fanaticism about it. I think what it did do at the time was, I really, really liked the first book, and I think the way that, I remember when I saw the movies and I was like, that's not Bella. Because she was supposed to be this super new, like, well, not super. She was supposed to be this relatively nuanced person who had, to my understanding as a child, seemed to be a little bit more put together than how she was portrayed in the films. But at the same time, it was one of those films, it was one of those movies that, like, got me. No, one of those books that got me at a very, very, very specific time, because I think the first time I picked one up, I was like 11. Yeah. And I was getting in the deprogramming era of that experience. So it was like, it felt like a big sin to be even conceiving of reading it, because the books had the apple, like the person holding the apple on the cover, and I was just like, I'm gonna go to hell. Like, I had all these fears and stuff that were related to that because of what I had been taught. um but Harry Potter was the same. I wasn't supposed to read that because it was written by the devil, so it was it was because it portrayed like sorcery um in a way that wasn't condemning it, and that was a big problem. So I was told with no uncertain terms that the devil had encouraged both Stephanie Meyer and J.K. Rowling to write those books, and that they had been used as instruments. So I was like, oh, okay. And I would be as well if I read them. And so it was like a big thing to be like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm reading this. And I kept waiting for something terrible to happen, and nope. Yeah. Yep, and you're so right. You're so right. You are so right, Brant and Ellie, yes. And in a full circle moment, turns out was actually written by the devil. Yeah. Although, you know what? I feel like we're giving the devil a bad rap because, like, I don't think he would write that. He would write better. Now, I am also just, that is a joke, but, like, still. Anyways. Okay, so speaking of films, speaking of seminal goth films, we would start out talking about the very first films made, and one of the very first ones was actually Nosferatu, made in 1922, and it is a silent film that follows a very specific kind of vampire that was way more, I guess you could say, accurate to how folk legends and tales would show a vampire, which also would make more sense in regards to what a vampire was supposed to represent in society. Vampires were often attributed to various diseases, and that, like, tuberculosis was a huge one, porphyria, because of the physicality that was often identified when it came to what a vampire was supposed to look like. The idea of a vampire being attractive to its prey, the way that it is now, as these suave, very often noble looking people from the 1800s, is not how they were portrayed at all, up until they were more consistently seen on film. Bela Lugosi from that very first Dracula is one of the first times that I think a Dracula was portrayed in a purposely attractive, but kind of the what was seen as like foreigner attractive to white Western audiences. So the tall, dark, and handsome idea is generally supposed to be a way of indicating somebody who is of color, but somehow still manages to be attractive to a white person or a white woman. And that trope. And Bela Lugosi was supposed to be that because Bela Lugosi was one, representing a character from Dracula, and Dracula itself as a story is supposed to be all of the things that Victorians were the most terrified of. Foreigners coming in from Eastern Europe and bringing in their like differences, and basically a fear of immigration and a normalization of xenophobia. And that was all the core component of the book that was written. And then when it was translated on the screen, it was translated in a similar way. But it's interesting because Nosferatu, I think, has only popularly been put on screen in the 1922 version. And then again, obviously, there was the 2024, I believe, film with Lily Rose Depp that also portrayed Nosferatu and explored the story in obviously a far more in-depth way than the 1922 version was able to. But the aesthetics of that movie from 1922, and also the film style that was very much launched through German Expressionism and in film, was huge. It had a huge effect on a lot of culture and pop culture, especially in, interestingly, the 50s and the 60s. The 40s as well, I will say. But there was another film that came out in 1932 called Vampire, which was also spelled Vampyr, which is an older form of spelling vampire. And I think that was another interesting exploration, that you have film, and the first couple of subjects people want to explore is vampires and fear and horror and seduction. Huh. And it definitely, I think, it may have been another one of those films that set the tone for what you could do with movies. But yeah, it's still, I think, it has, I think, such a huge effect on filmmaking, but also on the concept of shifting one's perspective from your regular everyday to something beyond. Because in Nosferatu and in Vampire, but also in another really, really seminal work, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there was such a intense approach that was very vaudevillian in style, which took what was normally something you could only do in opera or on a stage, and transformed that into a film where you have these really confusing sets where all of the the sets and the streets and the houses are these winding MC Escher like mazes that feel claustrophobic and very, very cold and very lonely. And the figures that you see moving through those spaces are feel ghost-like. They feel unreal. And the makeup and the styling was obviously also done so that it could translate into a black and white image because they didn't have color at that point. And that was a huge, huge, huge inspiration for many people. And it went on to influence 1940s cinema and characters like Vampira, which even though even though I don't know if Vampira appeared in movies that would be identified as seminal goth movies. Like I think her biggest one was Plan 9 from Outer Space. She as a character was iconic. I mean, so much about how kind of femme styles for gothic women were created came from and were inspired by her very specific styling. Morticia Addams from the Addams Family, also very clearly inspired by Vampira. And Betty Page was also another component of that because it was the first time that now that people had access, well, I guess you could say, as the ability to create your own films became more possible and financially feasible, more and more people were able to explore filmmaking in ways that were definitely, I guess you could say, non-traditional. Exactly, Brant. Brant also identifies it with vampires. It's deeply related to religion, and the cross and holy water always kills them, so it's always very supportive of the church. Yes, exactly. And I think that's another component that is important when it comes to the xenophobia that is present within some of the most popular vampire stories that were, specifically Dracula, that were popularized the most at the time, which is the idea that a lot of Eastern European people were, they had been affected by Western religious thought and especially Catholicism, but there was still, I guess you could even say, indigenous or older forms of religious and spiritual practices that were not sanctified by the church, and as a result they were seen as dangerous and magic that was unhealthy. Also, another component of this that is very important and not often discussed is Roma movement at that time. A lot of the people who were trying to escape the Eastern Europe at the time that Bram Stoker actually wrote Dracula were Roma people trying to escape enslavement. And obviously, we have a long history of having some very closed practices and spiritual practices that have integrated various religions from the different places that we've been, but we've always been considered like this dangerous, negative, dirty, scary other. And that was very much typified in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and is only briefly acknowledged within the actual novel itself, but and in movie representations as well, you don't really see that much about it. As is always the case when it comes to Roma people in film, we often are a kind of convenient side note for exposition about a character's villainness, or to establish that they are in some way suspect, because they either are someone that the Roma characters are so scared of, as with Dracula, that they avoid them like the plague, and Roma people are supposed to be too stupid to be scared of anything. Oh. Or they are working with the villain, and that's how you know that they're bad, because they're hanging out with Roma people. So, it's impossible to extricate. And this is something that is actually going to come up again in more of the films that I have to talk about in today's stream, because there's actually a film later on that totally uses an anti-Roma slur but doesn't even realize it. But anyways, so it's just a common trope in horror. But what's the difference between horror and gothic horror and goth films? And we're gonna explore that a little bit more in a second. But Aqua, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I would also be a villain if need be. So, um, thank you. I appreciate that. Aw. Except, okay, I will say there's one of the very few representations we've ever had in film or TV where we were still cast as that kind of like mysterious other, but we did something positive. Is when in Buffy the Vampire Slayer we cursed Angel, made him have to deal with having a soul and knowing what the effects of his consequences of his actions were. So, um, actually, Elliot's a good question. Would I be opposed to having a Roma character in a Dracula adaptation? No, I wouldn't. What I would really hope, though, is one, that they would cast actual Roma characters, and two, that they would allow the nuance that would be actually important for that characterization. So, for example, if they were going to redo Dracula again, for the many time that they have explored that story, if they were going to be redoing Dracula and they were going to actually have a healthy representation of it, what would be really, I think, ideal is to use the use that film as an opportunity to explore how Roma people were being persecuted in all forms. And it's if you're going to be having Roma people in something and you're going to be showing them in a way where they are still a vehicle to explain a character, give context to a character, you can do that. I do think that you would need to be representative of the Roma people involved with respect, and that's what's always missing. Yeah, yep, Aqua Bandit, you're right. Hunchback of Notre Dame also has Roma people as victims, especially the Disney version, but unfortunately does use a lot of slurs, and it does. And the Hunchback of Notre Dame is kind of I think it's a bit of a controversial one because it creates a kind of, what do you call it, the model minority stereotype for what we're supposed to be like, especially with the character of Esmeralda. Um, and there are people who find a lot of positivity in her characterization and her ability to question authority and acknowledge what is wrong, and that she has a unique position to do that because of her experience being an oppressed minority that is also still needing to operate within the oppressive system and survive. And it's a bit complicated, I think, but it's also, everybody has different opinions about how they feel when it comes to that film. I'm a little unsure of how to feel because when I see Esmeralda, I appreciate that they tried very hard to create a character that was nuanced and full, had full mentality, but I also feel like they, of course, because it's Disney in that particular one, had to yeah, they had to do they made some certain choices that I'm not. That's a whole other stream. We should have a conversation about this, actually. I would love that. And I love that idea, Ellie, to a remake of Van Helsing, but rewritten to make Van Helsing a Roma man would be, or Roma person, could be anybody, would be interesting cinematically. Yes, I actually think that would be really cool. Um, I think that could be really cool if like they would have to kind of rewrite Van Helsing as a character in general, because I think in the story he's a bit like he's like the anti-hero hero, but he's also a bit of a, from what I remember, he's a bit of a quack. So it'd be really cool. Grant, was Kate Beckinsale Romani in that film? That's a good question, because every time I see how she's supposed to be portrayed in that film, I'd be like, oh, I could cosplay that. But like, I don't think she was supposed to be. I think she's supposed to be Romanian, and or Transylvanian, wherever they're supposed to be, I forgot. But like, I think she is not supposed to be Roma, but she obviously has a lot of like characteristics in presentation that really come across as Roma. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think she's actually supposed to be Roma herself. Because Roma people did absolutely settle in all over the world many, many times, and stayed in various areas, and only had to like only moved when there was absolutely like when there was no other choice because it was too dangerous to stay. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how much that movie was looking to be historically accurate. I still love that film. It is not a good film. I know it's not a good film, but but it's my arguably bad movie that I still like. Please don't judge me. No, it's okay. Judge me as hard as you want. It's fine. But either way, I don't know if Kate Beckinsale was supposed to be Roma in that particular film. Although, again, stylistically, there are some little things that I'm like, curious choice there. It is fun. It is very fun. But okay, let's get back to the list. So oh, oh no. Okay. There's an Amber Alert. I didn't want to miss. Oh, that's bad. Okay. So I also am gonna start. I do think it's important to explore how vampires were some of the very first opportunities to explore kind of gothic, and maybe we're just very influential in for many people who are goth or in the goth community. But I actually have can you see this? I have a whole list. It's long. This is the beginning. This is the beginning. It's a lot. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just the start. So what I do also want to kind of talk about is like, let's see, we started with some of the very first movies, so Nosferatu, and the very early rendition of Dracula, which actually, by Bela Lugosi, which actually is what do you call it? When you make something forever. God, what are the words? What is wrong with me? Bauhaus has a really iconic song called Bela Lugosi's Dead. That is iconic goth song. Iconic. And I think that's the thing as well when it comes to film, is that in any community space, it's really hard to extricate the influence of one artistic medium over another, because that, like Vampira and her clothing styles, as well as Betty Page's, with the ability to explore, I guess, sexual content on film and create what now is the porn industry, but at that point was something radically different in a film medium, which before had been confined to drawings and photos. It was a huge opportunity for a counterculture movement to grow, and their stylings ended up influencing the fashion of, and began, I guess, influencing the fashion of many goth styles. Like Betty Page bangs are forever a iconic and consistent look. Immortalized. There we go. Yes. I love this. Timeless, immortalized. These are perfect words for that. Yes. Yes. Um, yes. Okay. So, but not only that, so there's like this consistent overlap between how film affects fashion, which affects music, which then affects film, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about a lot of the more well-known iconic goth movies is that the music is as important as the fashion, which is as important as the story. And every component has to work together in tandem for it to be effective. The Crow is easily, I think, the first and most intense exploration of that I can think of. And I know I'm jumping around a lot when it comes to timelines and things like that. But I think that's part of this, is that it's pretty hard to nail down a specific timeline of the most seminal goth movies, because consistently they've shown up throughout the history of filmmaking. And things that have influenced further creations have definitely been explored throughout the entirety of humans' capability of creating films, no matter what the films were. Like when I mentioned Betty Page, there is a huge overlap between sex work and also, I think, an ability to challenge conventional gendered norms and oppressive expectations and misogyny that was wholeheartedly welcomed by the punk community, the post-punk community, and ultimately the goth community, and very much, I think, became a standard of how things operate. So with that in mind, it's pretty hard to separate them entirely. So I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, so yes, there is. Yes, there is, Brant. There's totally a goth comedy. You asked about goth comedy. Yes, What We Do in the Shadows, the movie. TV show's fine. I like it. It's not my 100% favorite, but What We Do in the Shadows, the movie, oh my god, yes. Yeah. You have to watch it if you haven't watched it. 110 million, bajillion percent. Yes. And then anything by Elvira, anything that Elvira is in, she is comedic ridiculousness in every way. Elvira is another huge example of, just like Vampira. Yes, exactly. She's another example of somebody who did ultimately end up starring in her own films, but she was a presenter for horror films. And goths have a sense of humor? What? I know. Yes, actually. I just realized you weren't asking seriously. Yes, yes, they do. But there's actually so many different ones, and I think the Rocky Horror Picture Show in of itself is also credited quite consistently with the having a huge effect on goth culture. So there's actually a couple of different really interesting components that are all interrelated. Just like when I mentioned earlier about Betty Page and Vampira, and then just recently mentioned Elvira, Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is a combination of drag culture and queer culture in general, combined with camp of like 70s camp and also kind of sexploitation films and the exploration of what you could do in, I guess, sexually explicit films and the cultures that grew around that, all of that ended up in, like, again, becoming involved in how a lot of films were developed. So Rocky Horror Picture Show is kind of the perfect combo of all of those things, where it's very silly, it pokes fun at societal conventions, and it also pokes fun at the more damaging oppressive expectations of of misogyny, of patriarchy. You can see that in the character of Rocky and the way that he is idealized by Dr. Frankenfurter. What a name, oh my god. But yes. Brant says Rocky Horror is so much fun in a theater with a cast. Of course. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Absolutely. 110%. I remember the first time I think it's the longest running theater like film with a theater like ever. How do I qualify that? Longest running film thingy? Yeah, what are words? I am not with the words tonight. The words are not, they have left my body and gone somewhere else. But the yeah, so it's definitely, I think, important to as well acknowledge that a lot of what I think people assume to be goth film or kind of typical goth media, people often think of things where there's goth figures within the film, or they think of horror and would assume that all horror is somehow gothic. And that's not actually the case. There's multiple distinctions between what is horror versus what is gothic horror versus what is a goth film. Like, I don't know that I would qualify, and others may argue very differently about this, but I don't know that I would qualify The Crow as a horror film. It's a thriller, maybe. There's some suspense elements in it, but it's mostly a story of, well, I guess you could say it's a revenge story. And it's a story on just, it's a little bit dystopian as well. So I it's just kind of different. Now, then again, you have movies like The Craft, which are, again, a huge seminal goth film that came out in the 90s. And that one does have more horror elements to it. You have a story about a group of high school girls who have a little witches coven and become more and more emboldened to become more intense. A thriller revenge movie. Yeah, The Crow is a thriller revenge movie, says Ellie. And then and Zangton says not horror. Yeah, I would agree. Okay, cool. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that thinks that, because I feel like The Crow, I wouldn't qualify that as horror, but a lot of times I think there is an assumption that anything that is horror is also automatically also goth. And there isn't, again, just like with you know, Rocky Horror Picture Show, Betty Page, and Vampira, you have this overlap of a genre that's not technically what you would assume to be part of that culture, that storytelling mode, but it goes the other way as well, where with horror, you can have, horror is a huge genre that encompasses a lot of different types of storytelling and a lot of different types of stories, but it's not all automatically goth just because it is scary or it is exploring something that is uncomfortable or questions social hierarchy or norms. And I think that's Ellie asks, would The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy be considered goth comedy? That's a good question. Maybe. Maybe. There were a lot of characters within that story that have, I think, were probably like iconic goth characters. Although I do think there's a lot of iconic goth characters in the early 2000s, like animated media, cartoons, and things like that, that were definitely very influential on a lot of people. Like, I always hear about the, I don't think I've seen this, but like, you know, there's that Scooby-Doo movie, and there was a goth band in it. I think they were a goth band. Were they metal? I'm not sure, but aesthetically, they definitely gave off the vibes. Um, and that's always pinned as like a big one. Or you have, who was the character in Kim Possible? It was her villain, her antagonist, the green and black like stylized person, like stylistically was amazing. Hex Girls? Oh, is that it? Yes, the Hex Girls. I know that that was like a big deal for a lot of people as well. I don't know when it comes to cartoons. That's a good question. I feel like that is an exploration that we should have an exploration about cartoons and um, this entire concept as well. Shigo, there we go. Thank you, Aqua. Thank you, thank you. Yes, her. She was many people's gay awakenings. Yeah, LA just yes, gay awakening for many lesbians everywhere. Yeah, that's fair. Makes sense. It does, yes. There was a lot of characters like that in, I guess you could say, late 90s, early 2000s cartoon and animated media that was geared towards kids and young adults. But I don't know how I would qualify it. I definitely think it was affected and probably influenced by goth culture and punk culture and cyber punk culture and a lot of the general malaise and discontent that we've been building as a society for now multiple generations around fears that I think are impossible to extricate from the development of technology and the way that the internet has been able to connect us and also divide us in incredible ways. So and also have allowed us to become more aware of things that are quite concerning and atrocities within the world, but also to communicate with others about those atrocities and raise awareness and then take action based on that awareness. There's a lot that I think is kind of communicated through these different characters in shows that are supposed to be geared towards kids but have significantly more adult messages for a lot of people. Anybody who is watching who is perhaps not like a child, that were definitely in vogue in like the late 90s, early 2000s. But okay, actually that brings me to something I wanted to talk about. So I've kind of talked about like the early 20s and the early 30s of filmmaking and how these films developed that were originally definitely vampire films, or they were kind of fears of an other film, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where you have a scientist who's experimenting and it's a little Frankenstein-esque. And then this person is unintentionally unleashed on the world, and it's very it challenges your perspective of space and time, and really shifts how one can even see silhouette, because in, you know, at least in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there is a lot of like artistic leeway given to the creators to just explore, because there wasn't as much pressure in creating what would be seen as a wide scale hit, because like the whole Hollywood machine hadn't been invented yet in that same way. It hadn't had popularized in the same way. But there is a lot of German expressionist film that I think was extraordinarily influential on goth music, which also was then extraordinarily influential in the creation of there even being a goth scene at all. Now, technically, goth didn't really fully realize or start until the late, like just like with punk, but like the late 70s and the early 80s, because the first punks who, like Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus, were a little too artsy for what they had already created with punk, because Susie and the Banshees was a very deeply involved with the punk movement and was a early creator of punk. So was Billy Idol, actually. But all of these creators were growing up and realizing that they wanted to question more than the way that they had when they were literal teenagers and were starting to get to their 20s, and were like, wait, there's more to explore. And they were doing that with their music, and as they kind of grew and matured, they grew into a different era of ways of questioning. So they grew into, I guess, developing more of the kind of Gothic style. And oh, Brant was asking when did the Goth started, because it wasn't in the 90s. Actually, yeah, I guess I did just answer. But yes, no, it definitely wasn't in the 90s. It was in full spirit, like full swing by the 90s. But it technically started and grew alongside punk. But it was a little bit later, because the very first original, I guess, popular punks. No, I don't want to say popular, that doesn't make sense. But like, you know, some of the first bands and groups identified as the kind of seminal punk bands were also the people who started goth. So there's, and also just, I know that I was kind of identifying how it seemed as if a lot of those creators were growing into a different era and wanted to try to something different. That's not a commentary on punk or maturity of punk whatsoever. It's just an acknowledgement that these particular creators were getting a little bit more philosophical and artsy in their expression. So you saw a lot more people being drawn to German expressionist films, like the Bauhaus, for example, is obviously named after a German architectural movement. But let me see. Let me see. There we go. So Cabinet of Dr. Caligari actually came out in 1920. Oh, it predates. Okay, I was wondering. It predates Nosferatu, but it also silent horror film is to this day super influential when it comes to perspective and stylings. You see a lot of early goth bands taking on the makeup styles that they saw in those films from the 1920s, and then that were also explored in the 40s through character and the 50s through characters like Vampira. And then you also have pulp magazines, Betty Page, and the popularization of more, I guess you could say, scintillating media or sex-based media on a large scale, that was all affecting how a lot of, I think a lot of early creators and especially musicians were exploring the complexities and the hypocrisies of their day-to-day, where there was such intense pressure to get married, to have kids, to get certain jobs, to accomplish certain things, but at the same time there was radical economic collapse after World War II, and with before the boom of the 80s that led to the opportunity for so many different countries to essentially bounce back after the Reconstruction era from that took up the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the recessions that were happening within the 70s as well. So thank you. Hey Shadow, hello, how are you? It's a goth EC day. We're talking about goth films because it was World Goth Day on Friday, so we're exploring some of the goth films that are, I guess you could say, are seminal in the genre. But yeah, so you have these early like silent films, German expressionist films. You have these like kind of pulp films from the 40s and 50s and even the 60s. And by the time you get to you also have this explosion of kind of sexploitation and other kinds of like horror films that started in the 70s. You know, The Exorcist came out, and that was a huge film for so many different people. You have, I'm glad to hear that, Shadow. I'm glad to hear that. Yay! I also had a crash out with my PC on Wednesday, so I understand. I do. It sucks. It sucks. But I hope that it gets fixed. But you have these multiple different converging influences all building, and it ends up coming out the most, I think, when it comes to music. So that is where a lot of what have now become the tenets of Gothic styling and musical expression and political stances and cultural expectations within this subculture really coalesced into a identifiable thing. And that led to the creation of films like The Hunger with David Bowie, which came out in 1983. You also have films like Legend and Labyrinth, also David Bowie in Labyrinth, and that was a very different sort of aesthetic. It was a lot more whimsical, a lot more fantasy, a lot more fairy tale, but very scary and dark. There was a lot of darkness in the worlds that were being explored within these films. And I think in the 70s and the 80s, you start having a lot more, especially with Jim Henson puppetry, you start having a lot more stories that explored these children who were being kind of pulled from their world and put into an environment where all of their internal fears and anxieties were real physical things they had to overcome or that would actually affect the people around them. And even like in Legend or Labyrinth, you have gosh, what's her name? Why did I forget her name? Jennifer Connelly, in one of her very first roles, getting annoyed that her baby brother is someone she has to take care of, and she just wants to be a kid going out and doing like teen girl things, but she can't because she has to take care of her brother, and she's annoyed about it. And she wishes her brother away to the Goblin King. Goblin King is David Bowie, and Goblin King wants to marry her and be with her, kind of. Wants to keep her in his world. So he takes her brother, she goes to find him. It's a whole amazing and beautiful exploration of fear and consequences. And oh, that is a good question. Ellie asks, is David Bowie goth, or is he just around it at certain moments? And Brant says, David Bowie is amazing no matter the genre. You're very right. David Bowie is impossible to quantify. David Bowie is David Bowie. I feel like David Bowie absolutely has had probably one of the most consistent and universal effects on a musical level, fashion level, and personality level across the board of all creation. I don't know if you can qualify him as any specific subculture because he so effortlessly moves through them all. And he's infinitely influential no matter where he goes. I think a lot of the fact that he was always such an androgynous person who never quite fit into the expected norms and challenged them in a way that was extraordinarily confident and not necessarily brash, I think was a huge effect about that. I think that's the thing about David Bowie is that, and that I think also is reflected quite heavily within a lot of the movies and creations that were inspired by him, like The Hunger, is he had a way of exploring very controversial and sometimes really confusing and weird ideas with such lack of fear or shame and this intense confidence that wasn't cocky that I think really affected a lot of people. And I think there was an anger in it. That was a big difference too. I don't feel like you really saw anger in, and this is just my perception, in how he interacted with his roles or his characters or just him moving through the world. He always seemed somehow separate from it, but also deeply involved. So I don't know. I don't know what you would qualify him as, but he was definitely involved in a lot of seminal alternative works. Like Labyrinth was huge for so many people. It was a gay awakening for a lot of people. David Bowie, I think, as a person, was also a profoundly intense awakening for their possible queerness, or at least comfort with queer themes and motifs, just by his existence. He was so comfortable with all these different eras of masculinity and femininity and moved effortlessly between them all. So that's a good question because it's hard to answer. But yeah. Ellie says David Bowie exists in his own circle, so different from anything other subject from any other subject that the circle is actually a triangle. Nice. Yes, indeed. My gosh. But all of this I think coalesces because I know that like I have a huge list obviously of different movies to explore. But I think I am definitely hopping through the different components that led to these movies. And the timing of when they came out also is very influential as well. So another film that I think is often, we've kind of touched very briefly on the difference between goth and gothic horror and horror. We've mostly just identified that like just because horror exists doesn't mean that it is all gothic horror. So I want to explore a film that is so incredibly hard for me to watch, but is a good example of horror that is also somehow very quite gothic, and it is Suspiria by Dario Argento, which came out in the 1970s. It is a very interesting exploration of a woman who joins this dance troupe and a ballet dance troupe that does kind of like experimental dances and then ends up in the most intense, painful, and also somehow beautiful demonic situations. And I think that's part of what like if you had to identify what is one of the core elements that's different between a gothic horror and a horror, I think it's the approach of elegance when it comes to things that are profoundly inelegant. So there is like Hannibal Lecter, the one with Mads Mikkelsen. I don't know if anybody would be like, that's a goth show. It's not. But there is something about the way that the horror is handled that is so eloquent and elegant that it also feels like a good example of what that is, how that would look. And Suspiria is another one. It is at the same time horrifically gory, horrifically painful to watch. I cannot. But it's also done with such grace and nuance and beauty in the face of hell, pretty much. Hi, Riley. Hello. How are you? Oh, Adam's Family vibes? Thanks. Oh, cool. Oh, that's awesome. Yay. I tried to make the background fit a little bit better. These are just outfits that I have or made badly. But yeah. So let me see, where were we? Suspiria, and that came out, the first one, there was a remake that was very painful. 1977. So that I think really encapsulates how this all led to the creation of, I guess, the goth subculture by the 80s for sure. But 1977 was a huge year it was the first year that I think many people identify as the creation of punk music coming out on a wide scale. Thank you, Riley. Thank you. Yeah, I wonder if these are gonna come alive and... Okay, anyways, we're not gonna think about that. Anyways, but yes, okay. So it came out in 1977, and it encapsulated, again, all of these different components that were bubbling up in the world at the same time, and led to the creation of goth as a genre. And there is a very specific style that always gets associated with goth, and it actually comes from Gothic literature, which is a Victorian style. So by the time the 80s hit, you've had like basically a lot of pulp fiction style stories that have influenced it. You have like the kind of elegant but extraordinarily gory horror masters like Dario Argento, but as well the proliferation of horror movies beginning to get finances, beginning to get the financial backing they need from Hollywood to actually be created and be popularized. That was definitely a huge component of the 1970s and even the late 60s. You have characters like Vampira who were presenting these kind of like scary, spooky stories in Betty Page in the 40s and 50s. And then, of course, you have some of the very first, German expressionist films coming out in the 30s, the 40s, and the 20s. And being some of the very first films ever created that were explorations of fear and loneliness and rejection by society. And it's all building up until you get the actual, like, I guess you could say, identifiable goth culture. And once goth is kind of more of an identified subject and more of an identified concept, you start having, even though it's still quite small, and it's still seen as like, to this day, there's still a lot of people who are like, oh my God, are you goth? And they're very weirded out, but it's nowhere near what it was like before. There's a lot of social judgment, and it could impact a person's ability to get jobs, to have even, if I've unfortunately seen people whose kids were taken and, denied from them because of the way that they looked. I mean, it's the social judgment is quite strong. So you have this community that's thriving in a space that is also opening up on a political level, on a social level, for all of the communities that are historically oppressed. So you have a lot of POC people, you have a lot of queer people, you have a lot of people from the kink community, all of those coalescing and interchanging within this one main community, the goth community. And that's definitely starting in like the 80s, and you have a lot of films start to get influenced by this subculture, but it's not seen as positive. Instead, what you do start to see is you start to see an interest in Gothic literature being transformed into film. So you start getting films like, actually, Wuthering Heights in a way is a little bit Gothic horror. Largely just because of the concept of there being some kind of odd supernatural situation going on that is probably mental health issues. But you have a renewed interest in between the 70s and then the 80s and the early 90s with period dramas exploring the intense loneliness that is often explored best within Gothic literature. So then you have an interest in stories like Frankenstein. You have an interest in stories like even Jane Eyre, like the Bronte sisters' creations. You have interest in science fiction in a way that is significantly less technology based in the way that it was accessible by the 70s and 80s. You have a fascination with Victorian era fear and stylings, as well as the Victorian era mourning clothes, because Queen Victoria's husband died and she wore mourning clothes for I think was the rest of her life. So that stylistically became a renewed interest, because all of this is happening at the same time. You have all these different influences coalescing, and then you have this new interest as well in a era that at that point was long past and very romantic in its exploration. And for anybody who was alternative and interested in Gothic literature, it gave people an opportunity to explore that on a stylistic level with other people who are also interested, and to connect on a political level, and then to see that reflected in various films. And Brant asks, so what's EC's favorite goth movie? What should we see to understand the culture best? And Ellie says, goth people dress scary but are actually nice as opposed to most people. Okay, so actually, you know what? One of my favorite goth films, or films that I think would qualify as goth, is God, where do I even start? Hmm. Where do I start with this one? I feel like there's different genres to go to look into. There's Gothic literature, which would qualify three of the movies I'm thinking of. So Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, definitely huge one in the Gothic literature, Gothic horror film genre. And then I would say um hmm Frankenstein 2025 for Gothic horror. Now, if you're gonna go for just goth in general, I'm gonna go for The Crow and the Lost Boys. So if you haven't heard of this, The Crow and Lost Boys. Bobby Christine, hello. Hi. Hi. And then for horror that also has a kind of gothic feel, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. And oh wait, one more from like just generalized goth, which also has kind of a technological dystopian component. Dead City, City of Lost Children. I will write all of these down. Yeah. That is so fair. I love that. Oh my gosh. Well, okay, hold up. Wasn't the Babadook from Alice in Wonderland? So this is the other thing that I think is really interesting when it comes to how goth films can be qualified, because I've noticed a lot of people, if you kind of look and see if someone is going to put a list together. And again, I will have all of the films that I've referenced or explored today are going to be listed in the description. I obviously can never avoid, I can't just give you a list. I got to talk about all the things that influenced it. Sorry. But yes, Dark City's amazing. That's one of my list. So Dark City is actually one of them. So okay, so for Gothic like literature inspired or Gothic horror, which is generally focused in kind of like Victorian England, there's beautiful fashion, there's these explorations of loneliness and these very kind of oppressive experiences of a human trying to overcome or feeling at the mercy of nature and a greater being as a whole. There's a lot of, I guess you could say, a lot of it's a combination of certain components of science fiction, but also of a kind of spiritual oppression, as you can see. There's a lot of stories that focus on almost like deities and even pagan spirituality that's been oppressed because of colonialism and Christianity, Catholicism overtaking the indigenous practices and rituals of the, especially Western Europe, that used to be there, coming back up for vengeance. And so there's a lot of ghost stories, a lot of vampire stories, a lot of those kinds of fears being explored, and then a person trying to figure out where they fall um, within this world where you have the human world, which seems positive, but only if you have access to the right things. Otherwise, it's quite cruel. And then you have this like other world of beings that are condemned by regular society and being uh, going about their lives trying to either find a way to survive or to get vengeance on those who forced them into a space of damnation. So that's why I say Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, um, Dark City. That one's not a gothic, whatchamacallit, horror, more just that it's that one's just like a goth film. Um, but Crimson Peaks is a really good one, and Frankenstein 2025. So I'm kind of a bit of everything. Oh yeah, Ellie, I see that. Ellie says I love Robert Eggers. Is it Eggers? Who did The Lighthouse, Nosferatu, The Northman, and I consider him extremely gothic. I think he's a really good director who encapsulates that feeling exceptionally well. Where you have it doesn't necessarily mean to have a film that is kind of goth components or gothic horror components to it. They don't have to look like a particular way. They don't have to look like a ghost. They don't have to look like um, a goth person you would see at a club. Like they or just out in the world. They don't have to look like they would fit any of the assumptions of what somebody who's part of the goth community would look like. It's the mentality of what the story is exploring about being essentially excluded or incapable of operating within the normal social constructs, and the loneliness that that leaves you with, and the difficulty of what it is to exist without community. And the ways that there's also, you know, a lot of exploration within those films about otherworldly spiritual components that can really overwhelmingly affect you, but are only available for people who have been excluded from society. I think that's one thing that you see a lot in Robert Eggers' films is you have all these characters who are removed from their ability to operate within society as a whole in the human world, essentially. And they are now essentially, because of this loneliness, because of this exclusion, able to see all the things that are impossible for the average person to see or interact with. And it terrifies them because it makes them realize how much there is that is unknown. And it's a lot of this wrestling with the unknown and trying to figure out how to respond to it that is, I think, explored with incredible nuance and a lot of elegance in those films. But okay, so another film. Okay, so where was I? Grant was like, "So would you consider the Grinch goth?" No, no, he's just mean. I don't know. I don't. Maybe it's just because I don't actually like the Grinch. I've never liked that story, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that particular one, so I don't know. Other people, maybe, maybe. Um, One thing that I do think is also interesting in how a lot of these stories, the themes that connect a lot of these stories, if you're looking at gothic horror or you're looking at regular horror or you're looking at kind of just goth movies, a lot of there's specific themes that are going to show up throughout every kind of film. And that is a questioning of society as a whole and the standards that we operate within and why. Langton was like, he had a heart of gold. Oh, that's true. I think I just didn't like the show. The story, the film when I was a kid. I don't know. I feel like that's one that I'm just not very good at being objective about. I fully acknowledge that I have no particular reason to have any kind of opinion, but I'm just like, when it comes to the Grinch, I can't explain it. Um, Interesting, Ellie. So here's how I understand it. The Dark Knight from 2008 isn't goth, but the Batman from 2022 is goth. That's an interesting exploration. I huh, I I will say I don't know if I have ever considered any of the Batman movies post, other than the, what's his name? He made Nightmare Before Christmas. Other than that one, Goth. Let me think. The one that had Catwoman in it. What's his name? How did I just forget his name? Tim Burton. My God. Thank you. Thank you. And Aqua says, I think The Grinch as a movie can be a fascinating story of how society has come to expect simply saying sorry means instant forgiveness. Oh, I like that. I like that. I actually really, really appreciate that that perspective. Yeah. Why is it telling me? Okay, I'm not going to guess. There we go. Sorry, I was getting a surprising message from the thingamajig, which is the YouTube studio, but I think I'm fine. Let me know if anything seems off or weird. But here we go. Okay, so let's see. I think that when it comes to, there's like seminal goth movies, and then there's personal films that I like. I think that the general understanding of what qualifies as a seminal goth movie is represented from the three categories that I've identified. So you kind of have goth, which is like films like The Crow, and then you have gothic horror, which is often inspired by goth, like tropes from gothic literature. So you have things like Interview with the Vampire from the 90s, or you have Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. There's a lot of vampires in this one. Frankenstein, 2025, is a really good example. Crimson Peak is another good one. A lot of things by Guillermo del Toro are really good examples of kind of gothic horror that has literature, like gothic literature themes influenced, and stylistically has a huge effect as well. Very Victorian in appearance. And then you have horror, which is like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. You have Suspiria. You have you have Near Dark. You have, let's see what else. I wonder what The Hunger would qualify as, because that one's just kind of interesting. But perhaps The Hunger as well. Nice, Ellie. Ellie says, but people have to accept apologies, right? Well, it's a good joke. Ellie asks, is Poor Things considered gothic? I would not say so, personally. But I could also see how some people might explore it and in that realm. I think I actually, you know what? I'm going to refrain from exploring that too much because I haven't seen the movie in full myself, and I've only seen discussions about the movie. So I don't want to comment on that one because I don't have the right information to really be able to. But that's a good question. That's a very good question. I could see from the outside how it has elements that definitely could be seen that way. But there's also something about it that seems a little bit like it might not. But I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, there's also a lot of TV shows we haven't talked about at all. Penny Dreadful is a good example. Again, Victorian literature influenced sort of style. But then there's goth movies that are things that definitely don't qualify as just horror or like gothic horror in the way that they have a influence from gothic literature. Now there's another whole thing, which is Southern Gothic, which is very much kind of the Americanized exploration of horror that I think is inherent in, like, you have things like what do you call it, Hereditary, which is very much horror, but also you could argue could qualify as like Southern Gothic horror. But because of the American, like the kind of stylistic component of it. Now, then you have Dark City, you have The Crow. The Craft, I would also argue, is kind of more of a goth movie than just a horror movie. Especially because of the ways that it explores the story. I'm trying to think of how to explain it the best. The Lost Boys, absolutely 110%, was a huge influence for a lot of people. I highly recommend watching The Lost Boys. It's a very good exploration of, I think, modern. It was done in the 80s, right? Was it the 90s? No, that was the 80s. 87. Yeah. Yeah, The Lost Boys is, I think, another film I would highly recommend. Oh God, Zangton, I don't know how you watched it in theaters. Says that Hereditary in theaters was absolutely insane. I could not have done it. I am terrible with horror movies. I bet said your heart was beating out of your chest. I 110%, yes, mine would have been as well. I cannot do horror movies in a theater. I can only do them in very, very carefully structured spaces because it will stick in my mind for a very long time and I will not be able to escape it. So I don't do them well. I avoid them generally. But I am absolutely fascinated by horror stories and a lot of the themes that are explored within horror stories. So it's such a, God, what am I supposed to do with this? But I can't imagine how you handled that. That must have been absolutely overwhelming. So there we go. I'm thinking of all these different stories, like this list that I have, because we've kind of explored. Let's see, we've kind of gotten to the 80s. I guess we're at the 80s now because we've kind of gone a lot around before. But now that we're in the 80s, Lost Boys. Lost Boys was a huge one. Lost Boys was ginormous. If anybody does not know the kind of general story behind the Lost Boys, it's basically follows this single mom and her two kids who have moved to a new town, and within minutes both of the boys get really involved in some unexpected hijinks that are far beyond what they're capable of handling. The older boy also gets himself into a bit of a bind with a girl that he sees who is part of a kind of motorcycle gang, and it gets even more intense from there because it's also a vampire film, of course, but it's a vampire film in a way that wasn't really explored well before that. I don't know, maybe not well, but wasn't explored in a way that was as popular before this, because up until this point you have a lot. This is, I think, The Lost Boys is a really good marker of when 70s horror transcended the desire for gothic horror and gothic literature style horror in filmmaking into a different genre, which is where I would say goth kind of qualifies as. Ellie says, I have a feeling Midsummer is a perfect example of how goth people see non-goths. What do you mean by that? Actually, I'm wondering who are we seeing in which way? Oh, or like the townspeople and the people in the cult. I could see that. Brant is asking what goth movie doesn't have goth visual cues? Good question. I think A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. It doesn't have traditional like any characters that you'd be like, oh, that's a goth person. It just has the feeling of it. So I would probably that, and then I mean, Suspiria doesn't have any particular characters that I would say you could identify as like, oh, that's a goth person. It has horror influenced inspired characters or demonic inspired characters, but they're not, I guess, the idea being like, oh, they're made to be goth, because at that point, goth didn't actually truly socially exist in the way that we know of it today. Then so yeah, so you have another vampire movie with the Lost Boys, and it has definitely some breakout roles for a lot of different stars in it. Kiefer Sutherland was I think one of his big role, like big first big roles, and it was also done by a queer filmmaker, and there was a lot of the ways that the story was done. Some people say that it was made for the female gaze, and others don't identify it that way. I would like to know what you all think after you've watched it, because I could see it, but I also can't. But it's an exploration of like friendship, of loneliness, of being out of one's depth, but also of trying to fit in. It's an exploration of, it takes kind of this like trope that had been very popularized with 80s movies of like the friendship group and what happens to all those friends as they get involved in hijinks over a summer period between class when school is out, and they have an opportunity to be teenagers out in the world exploring themselves. And it takes that and turns it on its head. And it's definitely a movie you just have to watch, and then I want to know what you see. I want to know what you think. I want to know what you think once you've seen it, because I definitely think it's quintessential viewing. Even if you're like, I don't care about goth movies, that's fine. It's totally fine. It's still a film that I think you should watch, because there's so many references to it that show up in other places that you don't realize until later, and then you're like, oh, okay, I get that. I have watched that. Sanctina. Watched An American Werewolf in London. Yes, I have watched that. It was quite well done. Grant, you said it has a little of the 80s camp. You're right, it does. It does a really good job of taking all of the influences that came before it and exploring it in a way that was radically different from how a lot of other films were choosing to explore kind of gothic themes, where instead it was a very big divestment from gothic literature inspired horror that was very whimsical but terrifying but ghostly, but really interested in exploring the, I think for American audiences especially, the exoticism of Victorian England and Western Europe, which had taken over a lot of the kind of darker storytelling and stylings of movies from the 70s through the 80s and onwards. And it was definitely a fully American film. It radically shifted the mentality from being about Victorian era whimsy and fear to American, what do you even call that? American conventions. Is Underworld goth? Asks Zengton. That's a good question. I feel like a lot of people do point to it as a goth film. It's kind of like The Crow because of the stylings of it. I I know a lot of people do love that film. I think it's a great film to watch for fun. Um, and it does have really amazing fashion. So I guess you could say it is. I guess you could say it is. It definitely I think it's a good film for exploring. Yeah, I guess it's a good film for exploring kind of like the also again taking on its head all of the assumptions of like older stereotypes about vampires and then absolutely crushing them into something else and giving it a new breath, I guess, which is hilarious, like a fresh life. Another really good one that is an absolute 100% need is Queen of the Damned. Um, I am forever furious that they chose the lead singer of Korn to be the vocals for the Lestat character in Queen of the Damned. It could have been Villevalo from him. And I don't know if y'all know who that band is, but oh my god, his vocals are amazing and would have fit that perfectly. And he literally looks exactly like Lestat from that movie. Anyways, but yes, but that's just my thoughts. Queen of the Damned is in need. It also has, I think, one of the most iconic vampire portrayals ever, which was Aaliyah portraying Akasha. And I don't think you can get better than that. She did such a beautiful job. She was iconic in every way. So you have you have a big change that happens in the mid 80s through the 90s. And that's when I think goth movies become more about kind of an Americanized perception of goth as a separate subculture versus trying to hearken to other influences as directly. Like you had a lot of influence in like I was saying earlier with the Pulp Fiction and the Betty Page and the kind of the heightened sexualized medias that was starting to be proliferated because of the opportunity for people to have access to film and create their own films and kind of do more home movies and stuff like that. And then also a opposite reaction of being highly involved and interested in Gothic literature, and a particular type of horror developed from that kind of literature that has that existential dread, like Lovecraftian sort of eldritch horror style of like being the fear of of nature and the unknown that is beyond humanity, both on a spiritual level and like on a monster level and on a like a what is it, spiritual and creature and being, and also like possession ideas that was being explored. So you have these two major themes in how like kind of Gothic films and horror itself was also progressing. And then you get to the mid 90s, late 80s and the mid 90s, especially with like Lost Boys. And then you get movies like Lost Boys, The Crow, The Craft, Queen of the Damned, which are Interview with the Vampire, which are all exploring definitely all exploring this different facets of what it would be to be a otherworldly creature in America at the time, or in the way that people felt about America at the time. The Crow is a perfect example of that, where you have a dystopian environment where corruption has destroyed every opportunity for healthy community and advancement, and everybody is extraordinarily impoverished and struggling and barely able to survive past the amount of drugs that are being flooded through different neighborhoods, and there's incredible wealth disparity. And Lincoln, that's a good question. Thank you, Bobby Christine. Thank you, thank you. Oh, I feel honored. Thank you. And then okay, I see. Also, Zangton is asking: Is Texas Chainsaw Massacre Southern Goth the original more so than the other ones? You know what? I would argue that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is purely horror. Yeah, because I would argue that it is purely horror because most of the story behind it is the goal of creating fear. It's more about the shock of the experience than a purposeful exploration of a major theme or issue. Ooh. Bobby Christine says, it may not be precisely in the category, but I do keep thinking about Babadook, the mother's tremendous isolation from society. As a widow with a special needs son, the great supernatural force for reflecting her inner turmoil. No, actually, Bobby Christine, I feel like that would make perfect sense as a gothic horror story. That would be it. Also, the stylings of it is, I think, very much in line with gothic horror, which generally does tend towards more supernatural struggles and the ways that humans kind of often end up interacting with concepts related to supernatural or spiritual components when they are cut off from society and any of the guideposts that keep you, I guess, anchored to human existence. Hi Theo, hello, hello. Oh, you like painting? What do you like to paint? And it's going well. Today we're doing, in honor of World Goth Day, which was on Friday, we're doing a kind of stream talking about different seminal goth movies. And I've so far kind of explored some of the very first movies made, all the way we're now in the kind of 80s and the 90s. And I've kind of identified 3 different genres of how goth movies are made and what they're influenced by. So you kind of have horror, which is not just goth because it is horror. It is a genre that is often interrelated with goth, and you can have things that have gothic elements in them in horror without it necessarily being a gothic movie. And then you have gothic horror, which is very heavily influenced by Victorian literature from the mid 1800s and 1900, I think early 1900s, 1700s, things like that, where people were exploring supernatural fears and fears about technological advancement and changes in their societies, and exploring also concepts of like ghostliness, spirituality, revenge, very focused on this kind of being isolated from others on a grand scale, and also the oppressive nature of being a human alone in a space with like big castles or lonely towns that are far from human existence. Um, oh, that's cool. That's really cool. How did you get involved in that? Um, oh, right. And then the final one is what I call, and this is just all me that's kind of coming up with this idea, is what I call just kind of goth movies, which are films that are not, that may have elements of these other components like horror and gothic horror, but are not purposely just horror films, and that do really qualify a lot of components of what, or reflect components of kind of gothic stylings or goth subculture components within them, like The Lost Boys, The Crow, I would say The Craft, Dark City, City of Lost Children, um, Only Lovers Left Alive is another really good one. Let the Right One In. Ah, oh, actually, Zengton, you know what? There's a lot of discussion about Sleepy Hollow. I think a lot of people do consider it kind of like a modernized version of Gothic horror because it is, again, this exploration of an era, bygone era, where you have like these Victorian aesthetics and these fears and these social conventions that are being explored, and spirituality, and this kind of sense of being unintentionally or sense of being connected to something greater than human convention can define. And I think that that is definitely like gothic horror, definitely qualifies in that realm. But yeah. This is cool. Eee. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then horror itself, I would qualify like Suspiria, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Um, I keep forgetting about Donnie Darko as a goth movie. Donnie Darko, that's another one, definitely. Um, and yeah, Near Dark is also another goth movie that is still about vampires, or not a goth movie, a horror movie that is still about vampires, but it's far more focused and invested in the exploration of the horror than it is of like exploring what vampires are on a social or cultural level or how they affect something. There's a lot of romance, I think, involved in how, but not romance in the way a lot of people think of it. Like, there's a lot of romantic styling in how Gothic horror is structured and how um, that then influences even what qualifies as Gothic horror versus what might be just like a goth film. Christopher Walken is insane. Zongten, you are very right. Christopher Walken is wild. Um, Ellie asks, is Legally Blonde a goth movie? You know what? We're gonna say yes. Why not? We can make it whatever we want. Why not? Why not? We can make it whatever we want. Um, Okay, so I also wanted to actually talk about Tim Burton because I feel like he's a genre in of himself that a lot of people include in their lists of must-watch seminal goth movies. So he actually did when you were talking about Batman earlier. I also love Legally Blonde. Um, he actually did a live action version of Batman back in the mid 90s that was super cool. It was very Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where it was very German and expressionist and how it structured the sets and but also very Tim Burton, where it you could definitely see how his stylings were just so specific and identifiable as his, even in a set design that was physical and real world, versus his more well-known works at that I guess now of things like Nightmare Before Christmas and Corpse Bride and stuff like that. But I would say that like the Batman, let me see, what year did that come out? 1989. So his Batman came out in 1989. That one, and then you have Beetlejuice, which came out as well in I think the 80s. Was it 1988? Yeah, 1988. So Beetlejuice came out the year before, Batman came out the next year. And those, I think, are some really good examples of a very specific kind of styling that I would almost qualify, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, I would almost qualify Tim Burton's creations as almost like the Disney of goth, because it's like the most accessible towards the most amount of people while still really maintaining this creepy but cute and becoming the identifier of creepy but cute. Um, and then, oh, Theo says you went to a Gothwave festival. No way! What festival? That's so cool. Um, Beetlejuice is great. And then Ellie says Legally Blonde or Legally Goth. I like it. I like it. And Grant says, I guess she's an outsider at Harvard. That is true. That is true. Okay, I feel like if we tried, we could make it happen. We could find a way to turn Legally Blonde into Legally Goth. I believe in us. It's community effort. We can make it happen. I know us. I know that we're capable of this. Um, and then yeah, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all. Just like I am only using that term because it is the most accessible for the most amount of people. and I don't exactly know how to explain it otherwise. WTG. Oh, I don't know if I've heard of that, Theo, but that sounds awesome. Were there particular bands that you're excited about? That's cool. I also went to, I guess a goth, like, dark wave festival Friday. It was cool. I got to see Saint perform, which was nice. I was running around like a maniac trying to get videos of him. WGT. Oh, huh. I will Google. But that's what one. The other really big one is you went to Wave Gothic Treffen? I'm so jealous. Oh, Lord. Okay, sorry. That took me a minute. The response was ridiculous. Sorry. But oh my god. I'm so jealous. How was it? Was it good? Oh. Ah. I wonder. Okay, wait. I'm sorry. Total and complete tangent. I'm sorry. I must know who played this year. Whoa. Man, this website is specific. Whoa. Oh, it's still going too. God. If only. Covenant's playing? Oh, I did get to see. Oh, Cruel Ice is playing. Darn. Oh, Male Tears is playing Wave Gothic Treffen? How? Whoa, go them! These are Male Tears is a LA-based band. This is so interesting. Oh, Koala's playing? What? Rose Garden Funeral Party is playing? Oh my god, I'm so glad they've come back. Okay, sorry. Total. I must stop. You don't need to watch me do this. Are you serious? Ah, I'm so jealous. That's so cool. Oh my god. Wow. This is so awesome. I'm so glad for you. That's so fun. I've always wanted to go. I've always wanted to go because it's just felt like, I don't know. It just feels like it would be a fun opportunity, and the fashion. Ay. I can only imagine the fashion would be very, very awesome. But that's so cool. So you're in Germany. Oh, that's so cool. You're in Germany. I bet. And I hope that that was a really positive experience as well, because I feel like when there's different types of communities all over the world, and the ways that people I guess present themselves and interact is obviously going to be different no matter where you go in the world, even if there is the uniting component of being part of the same subculture. So you did? Oh, Theo, that's awesome. I'm so excited for you. That must have been so much fun. Ah, yay. Haha, that's so cool. Ooh. Okay, I gotta stop looking at who is playing. I must not. Okay, I will get so distracted. Okay, so what were we talking about? We were talking about Donnie Darko. We were talking about Dark City. We were talking about, okay, Dark City. You have to see if you haven't seen it. We were talking about Tim Burton. There we go. That's what we were on. So one reason I feel like Edward Scissorhands was a huge influence for so many people stylistically. To this day, I think some of the biggest mask style goth influences, interestingly, have been Eric Draven from The Crow and Edward Scissorhands. For anybody who talk to me, oop-a-doop, looking it up. It's a film. 2022 film. Oh. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, it's by A24. Oh, I wonder. Whoa. You know what? I do kind of feel like a lot of this is a lot of A24 movies are generally a little bit more horror themed than they are necessarily always gothic horror, but they definitely borrow elements from it. I think that's the beauty of it, is that it's endlessly interrelated with other genres and other things. Oh my gosh. I am very curious to watch this. I might have Saint watch it first because he'll be able to tell me if I can actually handle it. Because I will tell myself, "Oh, I'm fine," and then I'll be fine. I won't be fine. So, oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Ay, ay, ay. Oh, but yeah, no, this is ooh, okay, wait, this way. Um, Let me think. We were talking about Tim Burton. Okay, so Tim Burton is his like, and it definitely is representative not just only of a particular style of film, but I also think it was representative of a shift in style that was a little bit more interested in actually BDSM and bondage, and as well with the a bit of a shift away from the more Victorian inspired influences that Gothic horror had such a strong effect on when it came to styling. So, like, fashion is intrinsic and necessary when it comes to talking about film as well, because when it came to a lot of like early goth styling, it was heavily influenced by two things. It was heavily influenced by punk culture and incredible DIY aesthetics. It was essentially a darker approach to a lot of punk styles, and with at the same time you had a lot of color. You had a lot of people doing like the really big teased hair and a lot of mohawks and a lot of, which is unfortunately massively culturally appropriative because a lot of people that were doing that are not native, but you still had that. You also had a lot of it borrowing from Egyptian iconography throughout the 80s and the early 90s. Um, and then you also have this so that's kind of like one genre where you have this very there's a lot of like harsher materials or a lot of layering. You have leather, you have um, a lot of like rough components that are put together at home because that's what you have. There was no other way to do it. You had to make it yourself. Actually, Saint used to tell me how he'd use floss to sew his pants together and like rip off pieces of couches to create his clothes. And yes, yes, 110% Blade. Yes, 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 yes. Blade is 110% yes. Um, Oh, I like that interpretation, Theo. So there's also something that develops in the 90s, definitely in response to the development of the internet and in response to the development of personal electronic devices being significantly more accessible and proliferating throughout society. And that is things like Blade, movies like Blade, which really reflected the ways that people were scared of all the horror and evil of the world being hidden online and being accessible online, because that is one of the big things about how the vampires operate. They use kind of the club scene that had been developing more and more, and then the club kid scene that had been developing more and more throughout the United States, and especially throughout Europe, and with the internet throughout the rest of the world, because of the ability for everybody to have access for the first time to information that previously you could only get if you were in the market that it was being sold. So basically, if you were in England, you couldn't get the same records, the same music as you could if you were in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, in or if you were in Seoul, South Korea, or if you were in um, Mongolia, or if you were in Chile or if you were in Los Angeles. You couldn't get the same things. You couldn't have access to those things. Only artists who were so incredibly huge that they were able to cross the global markets and be sold all over were able to do that. So if you had smaller subcultures, you couldn't find those things except through word of mouth. Yes, that's true, Bobby Christine. You cannot recreate. You cannot recreate Blade. There is one Blade. But I know that there's been discussions about doing a new version of Blade. I don't know how I feel about it because if it's not Wesley Sniping, what are you doing? But I also see why they might want to. Still, I don't know. I feel like there could be more stories other than Blade as the only style of story for exploring the reality of being a black vampire, or also navigating vampirism and blackness in America at the same time. There's so many opportunities to explore being POC and being also a vampire or another creature of some kind in, I don't know, there's so many different ways to do it, and I feel like we don't often do that. We don't often get that opportunity in a lot of American-made media, which is frustrating, which is why it's so great that Sinners was able to actually be seen by so many people and be appreciated for its art form, because that is another really incredible horror film that it could even be qualified maybe as Southern Gothic. I could see it. I could see it, because it does have all of those components. But let's see. Monster House. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. What is that? They already tried to make a new Blade? Oh yeah, Bobby Christine, you're right, you're right. There's a line that they Blade said himself. And he was right. Anyways, sorry. I'm getting distracted. Where were we? Tim Burton, and then modern goth, like 90s goth, which encompasses things like Dark City, City of Lost Children, The Crow. And I realized earlier, Ellie had asked, what is The Craft about? And I had not gotten to your answer, to responding to you, so I'm so sorry. The Craft is a story about a kind of like, I guess, about a girl who moves to a new town, and she very quickly falls in with a group of girls that are both popular and feared within their school. So it is like a high school story. And it just so happens that those girls are also trying to develop a coven and are trying to develop powers as witches. It inspired so many people to develop covens of their own and to create them of their own. And it explores what happens in when those girls actually have access to power and otherworldly power, and it explores girlhood. It explores like friendships between femme people and how to maintain right and wrong, especially because most of the girls in that group are people who have been ostracized, even if they are kind of seen in a maybe popular way and are not directly bullied in school. They're not accepted. They're not liked. They're feared. People want to stay away from them. So they keep to each other, and they don't have a way to connect with the rest of their community truly or effectively. And then this new girl comes in, and she could if she wanted to. Even if she is also interested and more comfortable with those girls, she has that opportunity to connect externally. And it definitely leads to some really intense climactic conflicts. And there's so much more that goes into it too. Yes. Okay, we're definitely talking about the Matrix, dude. The Nazguls were gothic. Ellie, yes though. They were though. The Nazguls were a vibe. Are you kidding? Also, that one dude with the crown. Those were the Nazguls, right? That one dude with the crown. That was I want that armor. I want that armor. I desperately want it. They were literally all of Mordor was created in like this awesome goth castle. It was so cool. Literally actual gothic architecture, which is typified by that cathedral style of the points being kind of points when they rise together. So yes, they were very goth. The Witch King. That's his name. Yes. The Witch King could totally give me fashion advice. I'd be down. I would be there for it. I'd be very invested. I would want to know. What would he say? Oh, Ghost. I appreciate them. I appreciate them. Um I think they're fun. I think they're very fun. Stylistically, I think they're very fun. I think they do a lot of good things. You love Ghost. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, that's the vibe. People either really, really love Ghost. I don't know anybody who hates Ghost. I just know people who are like, oh, they're cool. And that's kind of what I get from it. Uh, can you be evil if you have good fashion advice? That's a good question. Who is it that's supposed to be the Devil Wears Prada? Miranda? You gotta ask her. Anna Winter? You gotta ask her. Because that's actual evil. Um, I think that's the funny thing about a lot of Gothic stories and Gothic components to begin with, is it's the aesthetics of evil and the mentality of true goodness. And then you have people who are truly evil and have the aesthetics of goodness. I'm sure you can think of who I mean. But yes. And yeah. Really? I love that. That's so good. Making friends in the chat. That's beautiful. That's super beautiful. I think that's super fun. Okay, where were we in our timeline? Because I like I said, I have this whole list and I don't think I've talked about a lot of them. Let's see. So, tracing back. We started with Nosferatu, went down, we were in the 80s, we were in the 90s. Okay, so The Craft. I highly recommend watching The Craft. I think it's a necessary film. There's so many, you wouldn't realize how many TikTok sounds or Reels sounds and stuff are from The Craft. Like iconic ones that you definitely know. They're from The Craft. There's stylistically, Fairuza Balk is always, she's amazing. Fairuza Balk is incredible. I really appreciate her as an actress. I really appreciate her as a style icon. She is an interesting human being. But okay, so we had just started talking about the interrelation of BDSM and bondage stylings with a lot of fashion that you're seeing in like goth movies from the 90s. You see it in Underworld with the full leather outfits. And that eventually translates to Scarlett Johansson in Black Widow. And she had like, historically the character already had that, but like you can see how that's so good. Um that's the thing that you do start to see a lot more of clearly in the 90s because BDSM and bondage starts, especially because of I think the internet, to become something more people are aware that the other is also comfortable with. And as even though it is absolutely vilified in most circles, because I think of the internet and the ability to connect on community forums, more people are able to actually recognize that there are full, like, lots of people who are very, very comfortable with it and invested in maintaining a safe and healthy community, and also ensuring that anybody who's not committed to a safe and healthy community is not involved. And so you start seeing an interrelation, and that has been around for a long time, between, again, queer, and this has been the entire time, but you see an interrelation between BDSM culture mixing and kink culture mixing in with queer culture mixing in with goth culture, and goth becomes a safe space for all of those things. So as well, for I think a lot of people, drag culture, of course, involved in queer culture, but I think one thing that ends up happening in the 90s, and possibly because, again, of the popularization of the internet and the ability to connect to other people on forums, that's then reflected in film, you start seeing more and more people who are able to acknowledge that they are interested in overlapping things. And so the goth community kind of becomes an overarching umbrella of a safe space for everyone to be involved with. And you start seeing a radical shift in certain clothing styles that had previously takes a little bit from some components of Victorian fashion and is reimagined in magical latex designs of Victorian era stylings, and especially undergarment stylings. And then you also see the more kind of traditional punk style being that shifts into trad goth, with the very specific makeup styles that were super popularized by Susie and the Banshees, or Susie and the Banshees. And she was inspired by 1920s German expressionist film and Egyptian motifs. And oh, thank you so much, Theo. Thank you. That's so sweet. I appreciate that a lot. But yeah, you're seeing all of these different components all interrelating and then showing up in films like The Crow, The Craft, in whatchamacallit, in Queen of the Damned, in oh my god, my brain, come on. Crow, Craft, Queen of the Damned, Donnie Darko, Edward Scissorhands, there we go. And it's quieter, but it's developing a new style. And then you also see a new thing developing, which you kind of see a little bit in Blade, which is the concept of cybergoth, which is a very specific style that is reflecting the fears of this, what technological innovation can lead to in a dystopian future. And it also kind of creates something called cyberpunk, which was very much influenced by novels written by kind of science fiction authors in the 70s and 80s, specifically Neuromancer. Who wrote Neuromancer? William Gibson, I think. Neuromancer. 1984, William Gibson. Okay, yes. So you have these other components all interrelating as well. It's just like this layers upon layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, all going together. And so they're also splitting into various components. You have cybergoths, which are very heavily influenced by rave culture, heavily influenced by kind of a reflection of fears of scientific innovation, and also an excitement about scientific innovation and an exploration of how it's being misused already. So there's a political component involved there. There are, Theo, you're so right. They're so right. Yes. And yes, Edward Scissorhands is an incredible film. It's also very uniquely gothic because it explores beautifully, but also in a very Tim Burton-esque way, which is why I think Tim Burton is his own genre of goth films, or gothic films, where you have a kind of otherworldly being that doesn't belong within the society that he has been placed, trying to figure out how to navigate and feeling the intense pain of rejection. But it's in this overwhelmingly, instead of it being a gothic horror like the literature style, it's overwhelmingly American in this like hyper capitalized super 1950s 1960s stylized space. So it's a really interesting exploration of the traditionalist structures of gothic literature translated into gothic horror films that is then reimagined in 90s America, which is idealizing 60s America. Alice in Wonderland, yes. Bobby Christine is talking about another connection is Alice in Wonderland, and talk about the Babadook, White Rabbit in the Matrix, Tim Burton, and then America McGee's Alice. Rave culture, also several Matrix scenes. 110%. Alice in Wonderland is another Gothic literature form that is hugely influential. You can see it in a lot of the Victorian stylings that a lot of Gothic Victorian styles have, with like the certain types of those, like the striped, what do you call it? The striped stockings and the layers upon layers, and even like the development of the style of steampunk is very heavily influenced by things like Alice in Wonderland. And Alice in Wonderland is kind of like David Bowie in the way that is affected so many different styles, so many different mediums, and was absolutely seminal in that effect. So definitely, definitely important. So now we have to talk about the Matrix, because we kind of talked about the stuff that leads up to the Matrix. Now we got to talk about the Matrix. The Matrix is the kind of final big, not the final, but it creates the style that is identifiable for many generations afterwards, to recognize and encapsulate the fears of this new world that is being unveiled and is leaving behind a lot of people that are trying to catch up and trying to figure out how to make sense of it, and also realizing that a lot of the opportunities and social structures that existed previously are not going to exist anymore in that way. They will forever be altered to some degree by the ability of the internet to exist, and the ways that we can use the internet to connect and communicate, and also transcend traditional hierarchical structures. Grant, good question. What about The Bride, which just came out? Hi, Hudson. Hello, hello. I would say that movie, I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure. Stylistically, I could definitely see how it's influenced by like Gothic fashion for sure. I have no idea story-wise, so I'm not sure. I can't comment on that one because I don't know. But obviously that means I just need to watch it. Ooh, Ellie was saying the devil all the time seems to be Southern Gothic to me. I haven't read this one either, or seen this one either. Oh, let's see. Oh, yeah, this is giving that. I'm just reading the little thingamajig, and that definitely is giving Southern Gothic. I now need to see this. Yes, I do need to see this. Wow, there's a lot of people in this. Tom Holland, Robert Patterson, Bill Skarsgård, Sebastian Stan, Riley Cohen, Haley Bennett Hill. Jesus. This is intense. Okay, this is a need to watch for sure. How did it only get 65% on Rotten Tomatoes? We will find out. But okay, so The Matrix. The Matrix, what's interesting is the same year that The Matrix came out, another film came out that explores the same idea, but a little bit more. It definitely doesn't have the same style. It does not have the same style. It doesn't have the same pomp and circumstance, but it explores a lot of really interesting things called The 13th Floor. The 13th Floor is a story that follows a person, a man who finds out that his mentor and the leader of the company that he works for has been murdered, and he is being questioned about whether or not he was involved, and he doesn't know, and he's trying desperately to find out what happened. And the man who you were following, his name is Douglas. What's with these names? Douglas Hall. And he has been working on developing essentially a simulated world that is just like the Matrix. you can plug into it, or they call it jack into it, and become fully physically involved in that world. And there's a timer, so you only have a certain amount of time within it. But in his understanding, no one had been able to actually jack in yet. And he finds out that his boss, before he died, had been doing it consistently. And oh, Theo, I have not watched the 2020 Dracula series. You mean Interview with the Vampire, or the is it a different series? No, I haven't seen this. What? I need to. Oh, it's on Netflix. Is it not on? Is there any? I'll find it somewhere else. I don't have Netflix, so I'm like, I have to always find a way around it. Sister Agatha Van Helsing? They've changed things. Ooh, okay, this sounds cool. This sounds cool. Thank you, Theo, for the recommendation. Okay, I am excited. I'm excited. I can't help it. Vampires are always an easy one with me. I'm like, okay. I give in to the stereotype. It's fine. But in the Matrix, okay, so in the 13th floor, you have this really fascinating exploration of an idea that is essentially what the Matrix is exploring as well, but in a more... What the Matrix explores in multiple movies, 13th floor explores in one. And it would be, I think, okay, so here's my case. I think the 13th floor is a really good cyberpunk movie. And this is why it's the Matrix, I think, is so different, is it because of the fashion, the cinematography, and the quality of how it was created, and the budget. It blew every other style of film out of the water that it even attempted to explore that idea. And the 13th floor was actually a remake of a story that came out in 1964 that was called Simulacrum 3. And it explored the idea of a simulacrum, which is what the Matrix is. It's the idea of the world as a simulation. And I don't want to give away the story of the 13th floor because it's really interesting and I really actually feel like y'all should watch it. But I'm not going to qualify this as a goth movie or anything of the like. And what I think is important about the way that it's approached is it's approached like a science fiction thriller. The characters within it are supposed to be very normal. They're not necessarily out of, like, rejected or disengaged from society. Whereas the characters in The Matrix are very clearly at odds with the world and with society. And the methods in which Neo in The Matrix is able to further separate himself from the society that he's been plugged into is by engaging with the gothic subcultures. Because when he follows the White Rabbit, as Bobby Christine identified from the Alice in Wonderland kind of like story, and which is very much a what's going on in that story, it is 100% Alice in Wonderland in the most... Lewis Carroll would probably have been proud in a modern day sense. I don't know if he would have, but I think he might have been. He was quite affected. How do I say that? He was on some things, I think. That's, I guess, the folk tale that goes around when it comes to his creation of Alice in Wonderland. But either way, I don't know if that's true. But either way, it definitely encapsulates a modernized version of what that would be, because you're literally going down the rabbit hole. Are you going to end up in a world that you can handle or not? And then you find out there's so much, and it just gets more and more intense as you go. And there's components of this story that in order to separate, for Neo to separate from the world he's a part of, he goes to a goth club. The first time he sees Trinity, she's in all latex. She's in a latex dress, and it's a vibe. It's a thing that is very, very iconic and perfectly encapsulates the combination of all of the influences that led to 90s era goth styles, which is a huge, huge, huge influx of bondage designs and the use of bondage materials like latex in fashion on a regular way, like for regular wear. Like before, if you like, you know, bondage has been around since long before Betty Page, but was popularized obviously by Betty Page. But by the 90s, it was a very different world of how that was accessible, and technological innovation shifted what people could do. So it all shows up in this film. All of the different characters, all of the different styles. It's radically dystopian. It's fully cyberpunk, but it's also quite gothic without at the same time being horror. It's interesting. Oh, whoa. No, I haven't, Ellie. Ellie asks, have I ever seen the last voyage of the Demeter? I'm writing this down. Okay. I have so many things to watch now. Ooh. That is fascinating. Okay. I have to watch this one too. But okay, let's see. Where are we now? So we're at the Matrix, and then the Matrix kind of kicks off a whole new world. But at the same time, you're also you get Blade. And so you get more representation finally in the film world, at least, for what was already very much represented in real life goth spaces, which is the fact that even though there is this idealization of kind of like the all white faces, that's not an idealization of whiteness exclusively. It's an idealization of the aesthetics of death, which is the pallor of death. It's a very different thing. So I think a lot of people assume that like goth spaces are exclusionary for anyone of color, and that is radically untrue. And also a lot of the development of what became goth is because of artists of color who created the aesthetics and created the social structures, and various people of color who have been involved from the get-go in creating those spaces and are the most involved at every point. So it's interesting because I definitely recognize that that is a consistent representation you see in film, where you don't see many people who are goth in their aesthetics before end of the 1990s who are of color at all. You get one, you get Blade. And Blade is freaking awesome, but at the same time, one person doesn't make up for the vast amount of people of color that there are to represent in the scene. So, Theo, yes, Theo is saying this is interesting as someone who first learned about the Goth people groups in ancient Europe. And that's true. The Goths were actually a group of people who had invaded, what was it, Gaul at the time? So modern day France, and traveled throughout Western Europe, and were had very specific stylings, I guess. But I don't remember why they were particularly, why Gothic architecture was related to their names or the name Goth itself. But that should be something that we have an exploration about in the future for sure. That's something I would be very interested in exploring. It's like, how did we get from the Goths and the Visigoths to Gothic architecture to Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus. What happened? But Theo says I learned a lot about modern goth. Oh, yay! That makes me so happy. I'm so glad. Yay! Oh. Okay. So I got to the 90s, and I feel like I should. We haven't even gotten to like the mid 2000s. Oh, but there's still so many things to talk about. Okay. Well, what should I do with this? I think that I've kind of traced at least a lot of the original influences, and there's going to be consistent influences developing as time goes on. Obviously, Frankenstein 2025 is another amazing installment in the Gothic horror inspired by Gothic literature genre of filmmaking, with all of the trappings of that storytelling style. And it also, again, is there any particular character that you could identify as like, this person is obviously goth? Not necessarily, except maybe Mia Goth, which I think is hilarious that her last name is Goth. Anyways, she always plays these characters who have deep, what do you call it? Very hard lives, very harsh, difficult, painful experiences. You would think that she would be more alternative in her presentation, but I could see why not if she's playing these characters all the time. Brand. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In every event, everything that I go to, absolutely. And another thing too is like, and maybe this is LA, but LA has a huge Latin goth scene, or at least a huge Spanish language goth scene. And because of that, that encompasses everybody who is involved or in any Spanish language scenes or spaces. So that means that you have all, how do I say, like all colors, all people involved. You have, because there's such a, I think people forget that there's a lot of Spanish speaking people are also black, like, and a lot of Latin people are black. I don't know why that's a surprise, but not that it would be a surprise for y'all, but just that like that is very normal and just maybe not as highlighted in media as easily. Although that's the beauty of social media. I do think that you get to see a few more, not enough, but you do still get to see that there are absolute healthy amount of POC and BIPOC and like people in the goth scene and creators. It's I don't know how you would not have that in any goth space, because of the general tenets of what goth subcultures are focused on. But I know that again, like I've been in LA for a while, and my perspective is probably skewed because of the fact that there are such a healthy representation of so many different racial groups here, and it's not like that all over the place. So I could see how it might be harder to find healthy representation everywhere. But yes, Brent, you're exactly right. A lot of people are also Native American, and a lot of Latin people are Native and Indigenous. 110%. 110%. Theo says the first goth you got involved with came directly from Africa. Yes. So, see, the goth is a worldwide phenomenon. It is a worldwide subculture that is very welcome and purposefully like a safe space for especially oppressed minorities. So that makes sense. Yeah. Actually, there is a artist here that I think has been gaining some traction who does kind of talk a lot about growing up in a environment that didn't really understand his personal interest in like Gothic music and industrial and metal and things like that, and explores his identity as a Black man who's also very wholly part of Goth community here. And I think that's important. I think that like you need to be able to have those conversations. It would be really great if we could have more conversations like that in film. And I think we're starting to see some of them, especially in more recent years. And, you know, I know that my goal with today's stream was just to talk about seminal works if in film that have like Gothic tones to it, or could be qualified as like goth or Gothic horror or just horror, that have some Gothic influences. And I am just hoping that, again, we can use things like the internet and social media to actually encourage and ensure that we have the representation that's actually representative and not just like focused on a specific subset. So thank you so much. Good night, Theo. Good night, good night. And I hope that we see you again soon. I generally stream on Wednesdays, so I will be looking into streaming on Wednesdays. Don't know if I will be in this or if I will be in my cutesy style, because I dress in two very opposing styles, so we'll see. Thank you so much, Theo. Thank you, thank you. I'm so glad you got to jump in, and I hope you had a beautiful time. Bye. And then Ellie says, I thought the Goths came from aisle 12B of Hot Topic. Man, Hot Topic was very helpful for a lot of people, but also it was kind of sad because it definitely killed some of the it's interesting. That's a whole conversation, actually. Having a conversation about Gothic fashion and its accessibility and the shift from DIY to the way that Goth aesthetics are so accessible now through fast fashion is a huge conversation, and I would love to have it, but let me know either in the comments on this video or in Discord if you want me to do I could do another Goth stream on Wednesday if you'd like, and we could talk about Goth fashion, or if we want to talk about other more like, I feel like we're gonna end up talking about films as well if we end up talking about Goth fashion. So with that in mind, let me know if that's something you're interested in. I'm gonna be closing down the stream for now, but first off, I want to say thank you so much everybody for having such a really fun conversation today. I really enjoyed it, and I know that there were some things that I was like ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, but I really hope that it was enjoyable for everyone here. I had fun, and I will definitely would love to do more of this again. I should be back on Wednesday, and then let's see. Also, I will be listing all the movies that I discussed in the description. So at any point, if you're like curious about these films, please watch them. They are so good. They're so good. You need. Only Lovers Left Alive? Absolutely. 110%. It's so worth it. Thank you, Bobby Christine. Thank you, thank you. Also, if y'all want me to do any of these films as a watch party, y'all, we will watch The Lost Boys. We will watch The Lost Boys, Only Lovers Left Alive, Dark City, any of them. I'm so down to watch them in a watch party on Discord on a Sunday. So let me know, and have a great night. Thank you so much for jumping in, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Bye. I can find the buttons. Oh, what? Okay.